Hey everyone, welcome to Feel Good for Men Who Want Change, the show where we have real conversations about modern masculinity, purpose, and how to build a life that actually feels good, not just looks good. If you've ever felt like you're stuck between old expectations and a new world that doesn't quite make sense yet, this space is for you. Today's episode is mega. We speak to Jon Alexander, the author of Citizens and the co-founder of the New Citizens Project. He's a former two-sport GB athlete. He was also once part of the corporate advertising machine as an award-winning ad man. But he left it all behind to help build a future where people don't just consume, but contribute. Where we act not as subjects or consumers, but as citizens. We get into some big questions. Why do so many of us feel hollow chasing the consumer dream? Why are so many men feeling stuck and disconnected? And actually, we spend a lot of time discussing, even if you reject that version of masculinity, what do you replace it with? How can the idea of citizenship, not politics, help us build something better together? And before we get into the episode, Jon's book, Citizens, had a huge impact on me personally over the last few years of introspection and men's work. It's really shifted how I see my own role in the world, and that I actually have agency and a responsibility to use it wisely. It gave me an answer to why some of the things in my career and in my life were feeling off. So it's a real privilege to have him on the show today. So wherever you're listening, stick around. This conversation with Jon might just shift the way you see yourself in the world and answer some questions about how to be a good man. Good to have you, Jon.
Good to be here, my friend. Let's do this.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. And look, I'm sort of somewhat loath sometimes to start the origin story, but I can't skip over the two-sport GB athlete piece and what that's meant for how you think about yourself. Give us a bit of history there.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first sport, I guess, really is part of the story in that all I ever dreamed of being until I was like 23 years old was a professional athlete,
Right.
rowing.
Right.
So I did junior under 23 international rowing. I was in the Goldie Isis race, which is like the reserve boat race,
Right.
a couple of times. And that aspiration, that sort of competitive thing, then showed up in my role in the advertising industry as well,
Yeah.
actually. Do you want me to go on to there? Or?
Yeah. Well, actually, before we move on to there, but it'd be good to just pause on like your role as an athlete, because I also saw that you then had a gap of like 17 years before you got into a boat again. Like, what happened there?
Rowing is a tough sport.
Yeah.
And it's pretty brutal when you don't make the cut.
Right.
So I dreamed of Olympic athlete vibes. And when it didn't come off, there was a big part of myself that I kind of blocked off and rejected in that.
Okay.
And then replaced with triathlon instead.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Out of the frying pan.
Right. Well, I think it was my other half was like, what are you doing? You're becoming the most irritating person on the planet. Go and do something else. So I did an Ironman.
Sure.
Obviously, as an environmental campaign, actually. But that's a whole other story, Tim.
Sure.
And only recently, my brother gave me a shout one day and he was like, we're doing a reunion regatta.
Yeah.
We're one short. You're getting in a boat.
Okay.
And I was like, damn. But it was actually really good fun. And since then, I've been on the rowing machine loads. And I'm actually contemplating actually getting back in a boat more regularly. So sometimes your brother knows best.
Sometimes your brother.
Don't let him listen to this.
Absolutely. And like you said, you shut something off of yourself there. Like, what did you shut off?
I don't think that is the biggest shutting off I've done in my life. It was a dream unfulfilled, right? Like it was from the age of, kind of from the age of 6 when my brother started getting good at rowing.
Right.
But certainly from the age of 13, but I think I was 14 when I did my first GB best. Yeah. And certainly from then it was like, this is what I want to do and be. I want to go to the Olympics. And when I got cut from the under 23 squad, it was fairly obvious that wasn't going to happen. That was the moment that day that I accepted the job offer to go and work in the advertising industry.
Okay.
And it was just a kind of choice of, right, I'm going, that's over.
Yeah.
And I'm going somewhere else now. And obviously it wasn't really over in multiple ways, but it was something it was something chopped.
Yeah. Okay. How old were you?
23. Yeah, because it was my last year of eligibility for the under 23 team.
Gotcha. Okay.
And I had dreamt, and I had qualified. I got into the team the previous year, and then not that year. And it was pretty obvious that the track wasn't opening up.
And you sort of touched on the segue into your career then, but yeah, you mentioned then the move into the advertising world and how that might have showed up there. Tell us about that chapter.
Yeah, well, I mean, the core, the sort of moment that I always think of, my first boss, who was quite a character, very madman dude. And he sat me down one day and he gave me a copy of Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, which is The End of History and the Last Man, isn't it? And which is this, has been misinterpreted in some ways, but broadly has this thesis that in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, we were in, the communism was gone, capitalism was the only game in town, and this was the way that the world was going to work. And he gave me the copy of this book, and he said something along the lines of, what you've got to remember is the average consumer sees something like 3,000 commercial messages a day.
Yeah.
Your job is to cut through that. You have to make yours the best.
Yeah.
And because of the mindset that I was coming into that world in, because I was coming from the world of like semi-professional sport, but kind of pro sport. Like I was paid to be an athlete from the age of 15, I think.
Yeah.
Not much, but
yeah.
I focused on the second half of the sentence. I was like, make mine the best. Like this is a contest, like 3,000 a day and mine's going to be the best.
Yeah.
I wasn't at that point, 3,000 a day?
Yeah.
Like say what? But which is where I later got to.
Yeah.
But I was more I was in the competition. And I wanted to make mine the best, and I was really good at it.
Yeah.
Right. And we won some awards and Agency of the Year a few times and all that kind of thing. And it was a little while. It wasn't ages, but it was a little while before that like little niggle started in the brain of like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Like, what does all this actually add up to?
And before that little niggle appeared, how were you feeling about transition from sport to career, your worth as an employee, as a man in that world?
I think it lit a lot of the same fires. The sense of team, like I used to love working on pitches, I remember. Because it was as close as I could imagine actually to the vibe of being in a crew, in an 8, building up to a big event. Like, and you would work late into the night, but you'd know that there was a big prize that you were doing it for.
Yeah.
And I thrived on that, actually.
Yeah. Okay. And where did this niggle come into it then, amongst the thriving at the time?
I think I've always had, I don't want to pretend I haven't always had some of that kind of idealism or some of that sense of a deeper questioning. It was certainly in me always, but I think it really came alive. My partner at the time, and still until very recently, she wanted to go and work in sub-Saharan Africa. She wanted to see whether that was the work she wanted to do in the world. And managed to get a placement out in Zambia. I went as well. And while I was there, had kind of a pretty deep experience of the reality of climate. Increasing floods every year in one of the provinces where we were.
Yeah.
And this was mid-2000s. So before, I mean, a lot of people were tuned in, but not many people in the advertising industry were tuned in.
Yeah.
And really it was that. It was seeing that, and then the initial decision I made was to try and, when we came back to the UK, there's a whole other space about like why that work didn't feel like the right work actually. But when we came back to the UK, what I chose to do was go back into the advertising industry and try and use those skills initially to sell greener stuff, like Train Over Plane, Rainforest Alliance certified, all of that kind of thing, and to make mine the best in that context. But then it was looking around and seeing that actually, for every pound that would be spent on those campaigns, I wasn't in a fair fight. There'll be many multiples 2 desks away, or at very least 3 doors down, because all the ad agencies are in identical buildings. They're all the same people. And a much bigger budget going on the plane, or and that, I think, was what started me really going into the kind of the overarching, like what does all of this add up to? What's the direct impact of any given campaign? And I could choose to work on sustainable consumption. But what's the cumulative impact of all of it? What are we doing to ourselves? This is when the question started to form for me. What are we doing to ourselves when we tell ourselves we're consumers 3,000 odd times a day? Like, what is that? Not just as any given ad, but as a sum total story of ourselves, background noise of our lives. That is the context for our existence. And by the way, that stat comes from like 2003.
Well, I was going to say pre-Reels, pre-TikTok.
Right. I mean, some of the estimates, more recent estimates I've seen for some cohorts are anything up to 10,000 a day, particularly young men, actually. To the work of this podcast. That's not a surprise to me. And this all came to a head at Oxford Circus tube station one evening, as I understand it. Morning, actually, I think it was. But like a couple of years on from that, I did a master's degree that was a sort of part-time group therapy. 2 years.
With the other students on it, or?
No. So basically, it was called a master's in responsibility and business practice,
right?
And it was, someone rang me up to try and sell me some sort of research product while I was in the agency, and I was like, I don't want your product. What are you talking about? And we got chatting because I'd been like vaguely rude.
How vaguely?
Well, but she took it well, and we got into a bit of banter, and then we ended up chatting for a little while, and then she started telling me that she just finished this master's course, and then we ended up on the phone for 2 hours, and I signed up for the same course the next day.
Amazing.
It was called a Master's in Responsibility and Business Practice. It was a course created by Anita Roddick, who was the founder of The Body Shop, and a few others. And through that course, that created the space for me to destroy myself. But it was like it was a week intensive workshop every 3 months for 2 years with a group of kind of 30 people from different sectors, different businesses, some from charity sector, some from government as well. Basically holding space to go, what is it to do this work in this time? Like, what is it to be a professional in this moment? And I was very lucky to find that thing. Like, it found me completely by chance, as I say. But through that held the space to really define this question and hone this question about this story of the consumer. And it was as that course was coming to the end, and I knew I was about to be tipped out of the end of this safe space that had been holding me to hold that question and to go deeper. And I'd started publishing articles and become a kind of a miniature sort of thought leader in the advertising industry, challenging some of this stuff. And as that was coming to the end, I was just deeply unsafe, right? Like, and that thing that had made it okay to ask those questions was about to end. And that's when I got to the point where, one morning traveling to work, Oxford Circus tube station, just all of these questions about what am I part of. I'd basically come to see myself as not as someone who was just doing a job and earning a wage and winning awards, and which is where I had been, but actually I'd come to see myself kind of as almost as a priest of a religion that I believed was destroying everything. Right. And it was in my body. And I threw up on the tube station, and it happened like pretty every day for a week, and then I quit.
And you talked about being a priest, and I've heard you say that consumerism almost becomes like a moral obligation for us, and it sounds like it was quite a wrench to let go of that obligation as it manifested in you as your career, which was fulfilling. You had awards, you were at times enjoying it.
Yeah. I mean, it's an identity. It was something that I was invested in, that I believed in. But what I'd come to see was, as like I say, as a self-hatred construct at the species level, at humanity level, and a story of ourselves. And I don't know, maybe this is where I should unpack the framework that I work with. So, and over time, I began to kind of complement this with other ways of thinking. So at the heart of my work is, and in the book and everything I do, is this offer of a way of seeing the moment in time we're living in through the lens of what I call stories of self and society. And there are three, actually. So not just the consumer story, but also the subject story and the citizen story. And the easiest way to introduce these is a kind of quasi-historical shift. So end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, like colonial Britain era, we lived in something like the subject story. The right thing to do was keep your head down, do as you're told, get what you're given, on the basis that the God-given few who run society, Queen Victoria with her God-given authority, know best.
Yeah.
And that is how the best society will result. So this is what I mean by a moral obligation. This is a story about who we are and how the best society results and what our role in that is. And it fell apart end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, because Industrial Revolution, rise of the middle class, you just couldn't sustain that logic anymore. And out of the two world wars, we more or less deliberately, more or less consciously created another story.
Yeah.
And that's how I had come to think of the consumer story. It's not just a consumerism in my mind is a word with a capital C and a hyphen between the R and the ism, because it's not consumerism as just a phenomenon of stuff, it's a story of us. And the consumer story says the right thing to do, the moral obligation is to pursue self-interest. On the basis that self-interest will aggregate to collective interest.
Yeah.
That humans are inherently selfish, but that we can channel that selfishness to something greater. And so if everyone does that, then the best society results in that way.
Yeah.
And what I believe we're living in now, and what I was coming to see at that time, was that story is horrifically flawed. It's better than what came before.
Yeah.
From the subject story, it's a liberating shift, which is why it was so attractive and why it held for so long, I think. But what we're living in now is the collapse of that story, because the problems, the macro challenges of our time are actually symptoms of it. So you cannot solve a crisis of loneliness and mental ill health from within a story that says we're independent, isolated individuals. You can't solve crises of inequality from within a story that says that everything's a competition.
Yeah.
And you can't solve ecological crises from within a story that says we're separate from nature and everything is about accumulation, material standards of living equals success. And I think to your thing about that you underline about moral obligation, the point here that is I have two kind of key beliefs, core propositions about humanity. The first is that we are what I would call citizens by nature. We are collaborative, creative, caring creatures who can and want to shape the world for the better. The second, though, is that we are storytelling and story-dwelling creatures. And we can't help but need a story to help us understand who to collaborate with, what to care about, what to create. And the subject story says, care about whatever the great man tells you to care about.
Yeah.
The consumer story says, care about yourself. Look out for yourself. And both of those are totally flawed.
Yeah.
The citizen story, which actually I believe is a much deeper, much truer idea of humanity, as I've said, and I think increasingly over recent years I've been digging into Indigenous wisdoms and appealing to that for forms of masculinity as well. But the citizen story says actually the right thing to do is to contribute your ideas, energy and resources, to reimagine our institutions, to tap into collective intelligence, collective wisdom, collective resource, but to be part of it. So the logic of the citizen story is all of us are smarter than any of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
That we get the best society by making sure that everyone is able to make the contribution of which they are capable. And starting from the assumption and the deep belief that the faith in humanity to know that everyone wants to make a contribution if it's made possible for them to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a lot more empowering than what's offered to us about the state of the world right now.
Right.
And there's so much to go after there, but I was keen to talk about how this maps the narrative around what's going on with men right now.
Yeah.
Because in particular, this concept of, consumerism as a form of species level self-hatred really strongly correlates with me to the narrative around what's going on with boys, young men, and men in general. In particular, the absence of connectedness, the pursuit of wealth, how those things aren't serving us in the way that we were told they were. How does that resonate with you as a sort of correlating factor of things going on right now?
100%. And I think I'd also bring the subject logic into that as well. I think when you look at what's going on, particularly in the US, there's this insane document that I came across recently, but I've been watching the guy who wrote it for a while, called the Techno-Optimist Manifesto.
Is that the Andreessen Horowitz guy?
Mark Andreessen.
Yeah.
And the core of this argument, the core of this manifesto, is the idea that humans are selfish creatures.
Yeah.
That we are inherently and necessarily independent, isolated individuals.
Yeah.
And that the task is to conquer.
Yeah.
That we have to beat a violent, scary nature. And that technology is how we will do so.
It feels like quite a fundamental principle to anchor everything to this concept of what is the true human nature. Thinking about Rutger Bregman's book Humankind, which kind of argues the opposite, and they lead you to, or can lead you to, very different places. It feels like quite an important principle that we should work from.
I think it's the most important question to ask. Yeah. What is your belief about human nature?
Yeah.
I think the reason I emphasize those two beliefs that I hold is that I think the weakness in the argument of the much more famous person than me. No, but in Rutger's work, there's this assertion of the goodness of humanity, but I don't think there's a clear enough articulation or an understanding of okay, so what about evil then? And I think that's where this idea of stories is so important, and the necessity for humanity to draw on stories to understand ourselves and understand how to be good. And so, and this is what's so fascinating about the Techno-Optimist Manifesto and Andreessen. These guys are on a mission. They think they're doing God's work, right? And that phrase has actually been used. There's this oversimplicity that we can have about evil or badness. That's that it's kind of malign intent. That Elon Musk is trying to screw everyone. It's much more interesting and much more important to try and understand what is the story by which these guys think they're being good. Because then you can start to understand as well, I think, where the phenomena of things like Andrew Tate come in. Because they are offering a story of how to be a good man. Yeah. And so is Musk and all of the sort of crypto crew and all of that kind of thing. It's way too easy to dismiss them without trying to understand what story they're trying to be good by. Yeah. And I think what story they're offering other men to be good by.
That is the interesting part for me, because I think it is too easy to dismiss them, and people do, based on the assumption that, well, no one's taking them seriously, or, it's a protest vote or whatever it may be. But the fact is they are offering a narrative that is compelling to men, and that's what's happening in the manosphere with Andrew Tate and many others, by the way, who start with something that is compelling, right? Here's how to be emotionally aware. Here's how to be strong.
And actually some admirable language in there. It's about how to work hard, how to be resilient, how to be independent, how to these ideas, and then where they go gets pretty dark pretty quickly, right?
100%. So we were talking off air, but there was this really interesting, Movember Institute of Men's Health did this report on young men's health in the digital world. And they surveyed 3,000 men in UK, US, and Australia. And what was interesting is those who followed masculinity influencers more regularly than those who didn't felt more positive about the future prospects for men. And they did have some positive virtues to do with, looking after themselves and those kinds of things. But it backslides even in places like looking after yourself, for example, they're more likely to train through injury. As well as all the other things that we're rightly concerned about, which is views and attitudes towards women, wealth creation, that kind of thing. But
this is the thing, right? Like, and when because there is a story, and when the alternative to that is only a kind of rejection of masculinity, rather than a positing of an alternative, positive articulation of masculinity, or taking some of those same values and ideals and building something different out of it, then you're not giving anyone anywhere to go. And I think that's probably the biggest part of the challenge, really. I think, and my hope is that, and what I'm finding it difficult as well, though, right? Like, how do we do this? Like, what does it mean to be a good man? Isn't an easy question to answer, because is it just to actually get out of the way and be in service of the feminine? There's some of that, right? There's some space to be created, and there's some. And this is where my voice is going to be more hesitant, and I'm going to be on less certain ground, because I don't know. And I think this, like, the reason I wanted to do this conversation was because I think this is one of the most important conversations that could be had right now. Like, what if the only alternatives are either the kind of hero, warrior, hard man, or the rejection of that, and the attempt to remove all of that, then I think we're in real trouble.
Yeah.
Like, I don't see a way through. And in my own life, I've experienced that. Like, a lot of the story of my departure from the advertising industry was about the rejection of masculinity, or about the rejection of the consumer idea of masculinity, the earn, win awards, compete, rise above logic.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways I have found some really good stuff in a citizen idea of masculinity, but it's becoming a very real. I feel like I need to be in thinking about that more. Like, some of it is about what you can do as a. I mentioned this idea that actually the in the citizen story, the right thing to do is to make your own contribution, but also to make possible the contributions of others. And I think that role of facilitator and space holder and champion of others and raiser of others, there's something in that that's very masculine, actually, that plays to some of the kind of, I think in Jungian archetype terms, you'd call it a kind of king archetype. But teasing that apart and making sure that it doesn't just become a kind of slippery slope into power over, particularly now as things get, as the world, like, we do not live in easy times to be a human of whatever gender, right? And things are getting dangerous. And as that happens, there's this phrase, conservative realism, that's cropping up, that is essentially saying the realistic attitude, the realistic response to the world today is to go, it's all falling down. And the conservative part of that is then to say, therefore, it's going to be a dog-eat-dog world. And therefore, the kind of manosphere values become. And with that, in that sort of logic train, it's quite hard to find the place to intervene.
Yeah, and it's only a hop, skip, and a jump back to the subject story, right, in terms of your model.
Which is exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
Right, like Trump and Musk are the fusion of the consumer story and the subject story. They are the strongman leaders who blame another and demand obedience in return for protection for their tribe.
Yeah.
And that, in times of deep uncertainty, is a very appealing offer.
You clearly have been thinking about this deeply for some time. Like, as it relates to your role as a man in this movement, like, what is it that you're finding difficult?
I think several things. Like, and for me personally, I think in my personal relationship and relationships, I have probably gone too far into the rejection of the masculine and tried to put myself too deep into service to the feminine. It's risky to be oversimplistic about these things, but I think there is a degree to which I try to sort of make myself more of a supporter than doing my work in the world. And actually, in recent times, I don't need to dump all of my mess in public on this, but in recent times, that came to a head, and I've actually ended up, as a result of that, doing an awful lot of harm to someone I love very much, and so there's a very important and had some harm done to me as well, right? Like, it's not simple, but that's super real. And understanding how I have done that and how it relates to the wider work in the world feels really important. Like, I know that for me to not repeat those patterns in my personal life and in my love life, I need to find a different way of being. And I think that same inquiry is also the inquiry of what it means to citizen as a man. Like, we know what it means to be a good man in the consumer story, but we know the consumer story is screwed. We know what it means to be a good man in the subject story, but the subject story is screwed. There are clues, and I think we can turn. This is, again, why I've been engaging particularly with Indigenous wisdoms and Indigenous cultures, where the role of the male, the role of the man is different and clearer, but we need to reclaim those. And it's very interesting. So, for example, in the sort of place that takes me is, we've lost, relative to Indigenous cultures, like rites of passage. Initiation, the sort of ritual death of the hero, and the ascent into maturity and as a man, and how we find those, reclaim those, reimagine those for this moment in time, I think is a part of the work. How do I show up when I'm invited into spaces, when I'm invited into positions of power, basically?
Yeah,
which is increasingly happening. I know I don't want to show up in sort of suit and tie and power, but I have been through a phase of showing up and introducing myself as half man, half Labrador, and kind of bouncing around and self-effacing.
Yeah.
And actually, I'm giving away my power by doing that.
Yeah. Is it almost like a protection against being overly masculine?
Yeah, I think so. It's part of that rejection. Yeah, I think that's right.
What was it that you felt you were shedding or rejecting?
At what point?
When you've talked about a rejection of masculinity or a rejection of a form of masculinity, whether it was when you left the advertising agency, what did you think you were subconsciously or subconsciously letting go of or rejecting?
I think I tied all of masculinity up in the consumer story.
Yeah.
So, like, the idea of competing and winning, the idea of trying to be the best, the hero, really, because it was a rejection rather than an adoption of something different. I think I was actually holding on to it, like, under the surface, like, and as you say, then coming to protect myself from it. Like, I think actually I was still trying to be the kind of the boy god, the boy hero.
Within the citizen architecture. Yeah. Okay.
And so how, and using self-effacing actually as a kind of weird gloss on arrogance.
Yeah.
Making people laugh as a sort of distraction from the fact that actually I'm occupying their attention.
Okay.
Some of what I'm working with now, I think, is like, how do I hold that space confidently and authentically, but also generously, and use the invitation into those spaces to open them and change them, rather than to dance in them, but with a sort of with a laugh and a self-effacement.
Yeah.
Because I think we actually have to now. Like this year it's 2025 is super real.
Yeah.
And there's no time anymore for prancing around and pretending that you don't think you have a contribution to make. I have a contribution to make.
Yeah.
I've got a voice and a role, and I am compelling and powerful. And I find those words difficult to say because I have associated being compelling and powerful with being a consumer or being a man in the consumer story. And reclaiming them and going, no, but I will be compelling and powerful, and I will be them in a citizen mode, and I will go into these spaces, and I will demand that they open up. I will use that power rather than abrogate that power.
Is it too simplistic to say that, you know, in shedding that perhaps unhelpful view of a man in the consumer story, there was nothing to fill the void?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd almost go further and say that because there's nothing to fill the void, what I actually ended up doing, and I'm only really realizing it in this conversation, was not getting rid of those things, but just pretending that they'd gone.
Yeah, masking them. Yeah. Do you think they have also served you on this journey since leaving the advertising agency, though?
Yes, doubtless. Not as much as they could have done quicker if I was holding them generatively and responsibly and consciously.
Yeah.
Like there's an extent, like I'm a 6 foot double GB athlete who's written a book and got 3 master's degrees. Like I've got pretty much all of it, right?
Yeah.
And that privilege, whether I pretend I haven't got it or not, is going to get me places.
Yeah.
And, you know, the hard work that's gone into capitalizing on that. But whether I acknowledge that and as I'm now trying to do, step into using that as wisely as possible and as generatively as possible, or I pretend it's not there, it's still going to work for me.
Yeah.
So it's worked for me.
Yeah. It's really interesting, and thank you for being so open. I think it's really powerful because I wonder how many men, you know, not being physically sick at the tube station in the morning, but dragging themselves down there, feeling the same gap or emptiness, and perhaps even questioning of the role they're playing in this story, but don't have an alternative to latch onto, right? Part of the perniciousness, in my view, of the consumer story is that it's just everywhere, right? And if you were to start to unpick it and untangle it, like practically and logically, you'd never start. Because, you know, just think about your career, for example. You take a career, you earn a certain money because you need to pay for the things that have been told you need. But just unraveling that in and of itself is a nightmare, let alone having a positive masculine archetype to step into as an alternative.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the prescription I would offer, I think, and what I'm trying to play with now is just get started.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe the point I'm realizing as I'm talking to you now is that actually to stare at the failures and flaws of masculinity in a consumer frame is to be drawn into a black hole.
Yeah.
Is to stare into the chasm and by pure virtue of staring into it, fall into it. What you have to do, what I am trying to do, is to stare at actually the same set of values, but through a citizen frame. Like, how do I bring my kind of physical presence and my warrior energy and my into the space of let's get everyone's contributions involved?
Yeah.
How do I like, and when I think about that, I think about people like Billy Desane in Grimsby.
Tell us about Billy.
Billy. So this guy. So Billy. Born and brought up in Grimsby, left for a long time, came back to when his dad, I think, was getting sick, and to a really tough part of Grimsby, even like a street called Rutland Street on the East Marsh, one of which at one point was listed as one of the worst streets in the worst neighbourhoods in the worst town in the country, right? Like the first time I went to visit Bill, there was like 4-letter words scrawled on boarded up doorways all down this street. And there was a council meeting one night, and Bill wasn't going to go because he was like, we're just going to moan and there's no point. And his neighbour said to him, our mums would have gone. And he was like, right?
Yeah.
And so he went along, and what he thought was going to happen was happening, because in the consumer story, the councils provide services and we go along and give feedback as to whether they're doing it right. And he stood up at that meeting and was like, this is nonsense. This isn't going to change.
Yeah.
I am going to go out tomorrow night and clear one street, and whoever comes, we'll go for a brew, we'll have a chat after, and we'll have some fun, but we'll have done something.
Yeah.
And so I think 14 people came the next night, 30 odd people came 2 weeks later when they decided to do it again. Long story short, but now what has become an organisation called East Marsh United.
Yeah.
Has a fortnightly magazine called The Proud East Martian.
Yeah.
Has its own little publishing house. Has they even a year or so ago now, they ran a £500,000 community share offer, and successfully filled that. Which was enough on that street, Rutland Street, to buy 10 of the houses.
10 houses.
10 houses.
Wow.
And refit them using good local jobs. Let them out as a social landlord, creating a sustainable revenue stream for East Marsh United.
Yeah.
And all of that started with Billy one day going, I'm going to go to that meeting and I'm going to stand up and say this story of it being done. No one's coming to save us.
Yeah.
And let's start.
Yeah.
And that moment, I would have loved to have been in that moment.
Mm.
And that I think is and don't get me wrong, like, and we should, I know you come at this from this perspective, but there's a masculine and feminine does not mean man and woman, right?
Mm-mm.
But there is a very masculine energy to that moment of standing up in that space.
Yeah.
And becoming the center of attention in that space rather than the platform and the people with status.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And look, I think part of the problem is that, male archetypes, quote unquote, traditional male archetypes or virtues have been commandeered by others, and we need to reclaim them back. And I think we've spoken about this before, but the provider protector archetype is such a obviously powerful message to link to a story like that, which is like a man standing up, starting somewhere and protecting his street, providing for those in need in his area.
Right.
Like that couldn't be more masculine, but it's just not a narrative that is, A, I would say, widely known, and B, widely offered as a path for men.
Right. There's almost a rootlessness, a dislocation that act on Billy's part was a rejection of, that I think is another, again, in the consumer story. There's a sense that you should be able to do it anywhere and be it anywhere, and what Billy standing up in the council meeting on the East Marsh was saying, this is our space, this is my space, and I will contribute here.
Yeah.
And I think that is something I admire hugely. And I think when I think about the men I admire most in this time, I mean, I think, or the men I admire most through history, like I was thinking about this when you sent this as a question in advance. So I was thinking about weirdly, one of the people who came to mind was Augusto Boal. Do you know who Augusto Boal is?
I don't know who you're talking about, no.
So Augusto Boal was a theatre director in Brazil, I think in Sao Paulo in the late 80s. And there was this astonishing moment in Brazil in the 80s where so many modes of participatory democracy were born after the end of the military dictatorship. Like crowdsourced their whole constitution, and the work of Paulo Freire, the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is the famous book. But Boal was a theatre director, but he along with many others decided to go into politics, and he became a councillor. I think a city councillor in Sao Paulo. And it wasn't long though before, as a city councillor, he was like, God damn, like my theatre directorness is the most powerful thing here. Like I need to bring that in. And he basically created what became known as the theatre of the oppressed, and is now being used as there's an amazing woman called Katie Rubin who's adapted it slightly and calls it legislative theatre, but essentially created this process where he went, let's get people who are affected by a given issue in the place where they are affected by it to create a story of that issue, act it out, and then in front of their community, and then invite the ideas of the community to be acted out into that scenario. They call them spectators, not spectators, to explore how that scenario could have worked out differently. And essentially it's a kind of policy sandbox.
Yeah, okay.
But what Boal was doing, I think, was he was saying, he had this skill set and this art and this power as a theatre director, and he committed to the place where he lived. And then he went, I'm going to bring my power into this place and into these challenges, and I'm not going to respect or bow before the ways that this role is supposed to be done. I'm going to have the courage, which again is a masculine, like a conventionally masculine trait. I'm going to have the courage and to just go, we're going to try it a different way.
Yeah.
And I think that the more I think about it, the more I think that kind of masculinity, because it's the same thing as Billy standing up in that council meeting, like sod the rules.
Yeah.
I'm going to come from my intention towards my community and my love of my place and my love of people. And I'm going to offer a different way of doing things, and I'm not going to be silenced.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that maybe that starts to get at what it means to bring a warrior energy, bring a masculine energy to what it means to be a citizen. It means to be defiant and strong and powerful, but rooted and caring. Rather than, I mean, I think this, like, I've had some very weird engagements recently with the sort of crypto community.
Okay.
Which I just think is so freaking poisonous.
Yeah.
But it offers, what that offers is a kind of, is a space to be a warrior, is a space to earn and provide and protect, which purports to be available to anyone. And it's just such a lie. But anyway, you can't just dismiss that, because it's speaking to something that we're not offering enough different ways to meet. There's a need being expressed there, and if you go into that and you go, what is trying to happen there? Like, why is this such a? Because these are good people, and again, you come back to Rutger, humankind. Like, people want to be good, but we're trapped in the wrong story of how to be good.
Yeah.
So what expresses that? And I think this notion of citizening, this notion of, like, maybe there's some things we can accentuate in it that are about, like I say, defiance, pride, love of place. Maybe that's the wrong word. Maybe it is defiance and pride and strength and courage to not to accept decline. It makes me think that one of the moments last year that really upset me was, you remember the riots last summer? And on the Wednesday night, so the riots were originally in Southport on the Saturday, and there was the cleanup on the Sunday, and then on the Wednesday night there was a list of 100 places, I think.
Yeah, I remember.
That the far right were going to attack, that was leaked on social media. And in almost every one of those places, at least 100 people, and sometimes thousands, turned out near spontaneously. Like, there was some organisation, I'm not going to, but turned out to protect those places far more than the far right. I remember seeing pictures of the sort of protection march in Newcastle, where they had like a poster that was, or a placard that was like, it was a picture of a Newcastle brown ale and then a Toon Army and Newcastle United shirt, and said black, brown, or white, everyone's welcome here.
Yeah,
and it was like, and you're just like, but like super masculine things. And then, so that night, I was one of several people who were kind of desperately trying to get contacts into the Labour Party and into Starmer's office and try and, because the speech wrote itself.
Yeah.
Like, this is who we are, British people.
100%.
This is, if we channel this energy, we can do anything. We need your power, your strength, your courage in the face of this nonsense. Instead, the next day, the story from central government was police in a strong hand has fixed this.
Yeah. I mean, what a missed opportunity.
But not just a missed opportunity. Like, utter disrespect.
Yeah.
For the agency and courage.
Yeah.
And the will to contribute of those communities. And that is so dangerous, because if you devalue that, people can only do that so many times. We can only unrecognized and unrewarded come out and fight so many times.
Do you think that, though? Because I guess one of the heartwarming things about your book was actually, in spite of all the headlines of our time being about decline, decay, and catastrophe, as you put them, all of this stuff is going on under the surface. And I do wonder how many, like, I totally agree that is a massive amount of disrespect. But I wonder how many people were even looking for the headline the next day. They just went home and were like, I'm so glad we did that. We did the right thing, you know?
Yes. I mean, you're right. There is sustenance in that. And if we're actually going to transform this stuff, there is, and this is where my work is taking me now, is into political systems and structures. And ultimately, we have to open these things up. Because I do think people run out of energy. Like there were community organisations behind a lot of that stuff, and a lot of time and effort went into them. And had they been acknowledged and validated, and had the culture shift that would then have meant money started to flow to those sorts of organisations, like that, you can't. Because what is happening is that we're going around this cycle so many times where people try and defy. And try and stand up and try and care, and unacknowledged, then you get to a point where, I mean, look, we're in the current polling, Reform will be the largest party in the English Parliament. Because people go, what's might as well, right?
Yeah. What's the point? Yeah.
And I saw some amazing data the other day that was. Which party do you trust most on all of these issues? And the single largest response on pretty much every issue was none of the above. The second largest was don't know. They were distinct options. And when you add don't know and none of the above, you got more than half of the population on pretty much every issue.
Yeah.
And the beneficiary of that becomes the subject story, becomes the offer of certainty. Because only people who, because that's all that's left.
Yeah. So what do we do, Jon?
What do we do? We get involved, man. But we do. We have to. The thing I'm most excited about in the country right now is a campaign called Our House, which is basically a nascent movement to reclaim the sort of spirit of the Chartists. Do you know about the Chartists?
No.
So this was actually, interestingly, it was a movement of working class men in the 1800s.
Okay.
Who came to a set of 6 demands for how the rules of politics should change.
Okay.
Including universal suffrage, including there was a requirement that you had to be a owner of property in order to be an MP. So that they would know.
Yeah.
And that set of 6 demands, they didn't try and just play by the existing rules. They demanded a change of the rules.
Yeah. Okay.
And fascinatingly, Billy and the gang in the East Marsh are now creating what they're calling the Charter for the East Marsh.
Oh, amazing.
But this Our House crew is starting to work on how might we get to a crowdsourced set of demands for changes to the rules to our politics. And I think that kind of work, fascinating though, that kind of work is starting to happen in lots of different places around the world.
Yeah.
So I'm in touch with some folks in the US who are working on what they're calling declarations of interdependence. So it's the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence next year.
Yeah.
Working with, and there's some fascinating stuff about the connections between Native American elders and the founding fathers at the inception of America, at the inception of the United States.
Okay.
So that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy,
the
Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee, Benjamin Franklin, among others, was in direct contact with them. And the whole concept of a federation of states is taken directly from the Haudenosaunee.
Amazing.
And so that this reclamation of the roots of American democracy is happening and manifesting as a kind of charter, as a demand for rules, not as a who's the next Democrat candidate who will save us, but as what rules need to change. Similarly, in Poland, there's work going on with the youth movement there. There's this stuff is kind of cropping up. It's of its time, and I think that, as we talk about it, I hadn't made this connection before, but there is and look, again, it's not a male thing, but there is a masculine energy to that sort of that. Apparently, there's this thing where when you may know more about this than me, but when little boys play, they try and agree the rules of the game first. There's something about rules and
I mean, look,
boys.
Across my daughter and my son, that does seem to play out. I haven't got any data on it, but my N of 2 experience would seem to correspond with that.
And so there's something interesting in that. And again, like let's not equate masculine with male and feminine with female, but there's something interesting in, we actually need in this moment a kind of change that refuses to accept playing by the rules we're given.
Yeah.
And I think that I would be intrigued to I will go deeper after this conversation into the sort of archetypal roots of that, and like what that is it makes me think of, so one in the kind of Jungian work, there's this thing about, he took the king, warrior, magician, lover are the kind of 4. And the magician, actually, some of the other language for that is the sort of trickster and that is about not accepting the terms of a debate, of a conversation, insisting on nuance and mess. And finding ways through that I think is present in this.
Yeah. I mean, look, you are the storyteller in chief, right? And I think the storyteller component to this is so powerful, because I think we are, and this has actually interestingly come up in each of my conversations so far, whether we're talking about masculinity as it relates to climate change, masculinity whether it relates to DEI, masculinity whether it relates to parenting, of like a missed opportunity to tell a different story about how we want this archetype to appear in today's world. And actually the alternative archetype is being provided by strong men who would have us live in a subject world again, or those who would drag us into the manosphere.
And that's right, actually. So the other work that I am heavily engaged in is storytelling. I do think it's necessary that we shift how power works, how systems and structures work. And I think that we can do an awful lot in that direction by ensuring that a different set of stories get told. And I'm working with a guy called Baratunde Thurston in the States. He has this language, How to Citizen. He and his wife started a podcast a few years back with that name. And we've been breathing new life into that language by telling the stories of communities, people in communities coming together to write their own rules, to figure themselves out, and rejecting the kind of paradigm of the consumer. So whether that's mutual aid in the aftermath of the Los Angeles fires, whether that's a library becoming a kind of community hub, and creating space for people to tell their own stories. And by telling these stories, what we're doing is we're essentially insisting that human nature is something different.
Yeah.
We're challenging the lazy acceptance of a consumer story that is so deeply ingrained. Because it's not just the 3,000, in a way that the 3 or 10 or however many thousand like paid for messages a day are the least of the problem.
Yeah.
It's actually when our politicians assume that they have to appeal to our individual self-interest in order to win our votes.
Yeah.
When they assume that our votes are our only agency. When our media report on the latest GDP figures and then translate that immediately into consumer spending and consumer confidence.
Yeah.
Like, all of those moments are telling us a story about who we are and how we'll respond. And look, to come back to that thing I talked about conservative realism before. I think I would love us to go. I don't know how long we have, but that into this space of things are not good. Like, the institutions of our societies are failing objectively.
Yeah.
And there's a decent chance, like, a lot of things are going to come crashing. They already kind of have in some ways. And unless we can tell a different story about who we are and how we might respond to that, and actually a story that's true, because every time there's a disaster, what happens is people look out for each other. Like, think back to COVID, think to the street WhatsApp groups and the mutual aid groups, and think to the NHS first responder scheme that the website crashed when 3 times as many people as had been anticipated applied within the first 24 hours. Like, that is who we are. And if we can tell that story, then the work of, that word prepping. Like, the default meaning of that at the moment is a kind of conservative realism, a subjecty thing of like, get enough guns and ammo and food that you can survive. And obviously that's the real prepping is citizening, building relationship, committing to community, making sure that East Marsh people know each other and are self-determining and self-reliant and able to face challenge together. That's prepping.
Yeah.
There's 2 options really, right? Like, what we are doing might be trying to transform our political institutions such that we can face the challenges of our time. And in that case, what we need to do is tell stories about people being citizens, not just consumers, and breaking open those institutions, taking those stories into the halls of power and saying, you need to open the hell up. That's option 1. Option 2 is it's too late, and those halls of power can't open up, and they're going to lose their grip and it's going to fall down. In that world, what we need to do is tell stories of citizening, find one another, start building community so that we can, because we'll always have something. And so that work of storytelling, in a way, is actually more important than the work of transforming institutions.
Yeah, because it's almost like whichever of those scenarios comes to pass, the emergent system that you want ready to replace it is one of connectedness and citizens and, people taking pride in their communities.
To get there is going to require a different expression of the same of masculinity. We won't get there without that.
Yeah, because it's too easy sometimes to talk about masculinity and what's going on with men, but the reality is there's many types of men in this story, but really the architects of the consumer story, I would argue, as you describe it, I mean, you're the expert on this, but like, are men. And so they're the architects of it, and then there's everyone who's been left behind by it too, which is the young men who are suffering right now. So there's kind of 2 types of movement we need, right? Do you even need those, or the architects to have a moment? And then there's everyone who's not an architect to reimagine themselves as a citizen too.
I think we do need both, and we need different things from them.
Yeah.
I think we need the architects to see people differently, to see people as citizens, not consumers, to see their role as being to design and create processes and structures that invite people into their agency, not just sell them stuff, that start from belief in humanity. And that's the big challenge to them.
Yeah.
To lose their hero complexes and come down alongside. And that's alongside women and marginalized people and people of color and see the role of the privileged masculine maybe as to be a platform and a space holder and a facilitator, not a commander or the fake idea of a servant, which is just so riddled with the hero complex.
Yeah,
that's that challenge. And then with the young men, the working class men, who are among the harmed, I think that's about offering a masculinity that is of pride and courage and power and strength, that is on behalf of community and connectedness, not on behalf of individualism and separation. And if you can do those things, we're so close to such a different story. And I go back to that moment of the riots and that Wednesday night and the Thursday morning, because the reason why I find it so upsetting, actually, is that had that speech been made, I mean, honestly, like, imagine that morning. Have you seen the Daily Mail front page from that Thursday?
No.
Daily Mail front page is community. I'll find it for you, and you can attach it to the show notes or something. But it's I saved it. It's a shot of one of the protection rallies, and the headline is something like "Crowds town out to turn back fascist thugs." Yeah. The Daily Mail.
Yeah, unbelievable.
And like my pulse was racing that morning to see what was going to come, and that had that speech been made, this is who we are. This is the nation I'm proud to be part of. I am today more proud to be British than I have ever been.
Yeah.
The story that could have been told of our nation so easily.
Yeah.
But then what that could have unlocked. That choice of direction will come again.
Yeah.
And if it's made, things will change very dramatically, very quickly.
Yeah.
I really believe that.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And I think what I missed in my initial reaction when I said, would people not do it anyway, was actually the amplifying effect it would have had on people's feelings in the first place. Because I remember looking in my town to see if there was a counter protest, and there wasn't. And I remember having a feeling of pride of like, no one's even gathering here. Like, there's no need, right? And I took a small amount of pride. And then, you're right. If you were to tune in and be like, actually, this is the country that I'm proud to be part of, it would have had an amplifying effect on that pride. And that was for me, who just didn't even have anywhere to go, let alone someone who turned up. So you're right. I think what I missed, it was understated and is a continuous missed opportunity, is what it would do to the citizening that is already happening.
Right. And at some point, that citizening is going to need endorsement. It's going to need validation to really, really flourish.
Yeah. Well, I keep coming back to, I know it feels like a very sort of tactical, practical moment in what are some big things we've spoken about today, but your career change. Because I feel like there's a lot of, think about like the movable middle, right? The persuadable man who's like, I get it. I see the climate stories. I see this, I see that. But like, I've got a job, got a mortgage. Like, what do I do? And like, there's not enough, I don't think, relatable stories or people who've already trodden that path that people can see, I'm going to go do that. I'm going to go be Billy. I want to latch onto Jon's work, whatever it may be.
I hope that's the case. And I'll be very proud if it is. I mean, I think if I'm speaking directly to people in that situation, I think what I say to them is, firstly, I will offer you some empathy. Like, it's a very hard time to be human of any gender, as we've said. And we have to live in the story we're in. Some of us have the choice to change that story. Keir Starmer could have changed that story that day, but most of us don't every day. And you have to. So what's so hard is we have to live in two stories at once. But you do have to live in two stories at once.
Yeah.
Once you can see this, you're abdicating responsibility. If you don't try and find something to do in the other. And so my basically what I'm saying is, if you feel you're trapped in your professional life, that you have to keep earning the salary to keep paying the mortgage and so forth, I feel you.
Yeah.
And have a look around your town.
Yeah.
Look for what's going on. Look for what you care about and love in that place. Find the others, because there will be others. And just go.
Yeah.
Join in. You don't have to lead.
Yeah.
First. But go and join in and acknowledge that ache in you. Don't pretend it's not there. And be part of those conversations, because they will be building. And if everyone who's feeling what you're feeling goes to those conversations and then is sitting in those meetings and lets themselves speak up when they have an energy to, like Billy did, that's what matters.
Yeah.
You don't have to throw your job in like I did. You can. But if you can, you do it.
Yeah.
But if you can't, that isn't the end of your agency.
And it doesn't have to be the end of the journey either, right? Like yours was, I think you'd agree, a multi-year process that is ongoing. You know, these
constructing these things as like massive binaries. Like, I mean, it took a 2-year master's degree to hold the space for me to actually be able to do that.
Yeah.
It's easy to tell that story in a way that makes it sound kind of like I'm braver or whatever nonsense. It's just you have to feed it though. It's like a friend of mine, Stephen Green, has this phrase. He says, "Citizenship is a muscle you build, not a cup you empty."
Yeah.
And that muscle has atrophied in a lot of us.
Yeah.
Because we've been told not to use it.
Yeah.
But like starting to exercise it, just like any muscle, like you start to feel it and you start to like it.
Yeah.
And that's what to do.
And I might humbly suggest, if people haven't, as a first step, they could pick up your book, because I know for me, like it's been a multi-year process of exploring what it means to be a man and what kind of man do I want to be and how do I want to show up. And there is a sort of penny drop moment. If people haven't heard of this concept and thought about or been able to put a name to something that is wrong, and then be able to envisage a different life for themselves and a different way to show up.
Thank you. No, I hope people do. And I'd also encourage people to look for campaigns like Our House and just to get involved. But this moment comes back to this idea of faith in humanity and not dismissing those. There's a sort of problematization of the young men in particular that I think is really dangerous. And understanding that this can be a thing of like of another role, I think could be huge.
Yeah.
And maybe the additional sort of invocation to action on the part of your listeners is the moment you start to show up in your place, even just for one meeting of whatever. You're becoming a role model for something else as well.
Yeah.
And we need that very badly.
Yeah.
So read the book, whatever.
Yeah.
Listen to it, listen to this, chat to your friends, but connect.
Yeah.
Connect.
Yeah. Is there anywhere else you want to direct people toward?
Yeah, I mean, so the work I'm doing at Baratunde at the moment, we've done one kind of experiment in telling stories from the US.
Yeah.
But we're going to partner and do more. We're going to try and involve more storytellers. We're going to try and build a whole thing.
Amazing.
There's a URL, stories.howtocitizen.com, if people want to be on that mailing list. That we don't know exactly what we're going to do next. We don't know how much resource we've got. We haven't had the funder meetings yet. It's too new, but we're going to do stuff.
Yeah.
And if you want to be part of that and follow it, get on that mailing list.
Yeah.
And if you've got ideas for what we should do, tell us. The other thing is a nascent movement called Actionism, which is going to be building and doing some storytelling as well. I'd direct you to the work of a guy called Matt Golding and Antidote Studio. So many things, but most of all, I'd direct you back to the place you live, the place you love.
Yeah.
Find the others. Yeah. Get involved.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right, well, Jon, look, thank you so much for your insight, your openness. I think we've covered a lot. We could have covered much more, but at some point we've got to land this plane. So, thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.
If something in today's conversation resonated with you, I'd love it if you could take a second to share this episode, leave a review, or just send it to a mate who might need to hear it. That's how this movement grows, man by man, story by story. For me personally, there's been a lot to ponder after this conversation. The idea that agency isn't just about big, heroic moments, but about small, everyday choices that stack up over time in how we want to show up. And that masculinity at its best can be a real force for good if we choose to use it consciously. Jon and I really played around with this idea of an alternative to traditional masculinity, not just from the work he sees, but in his own journey. The stories of citizenship we hear are so empowering and inspiring, it's hard not to be fired up by what he shared. So if you're curious about going deeper, whether it's through coaching, writing, or finding other men who are walking the same path, head over to thefeelgoodfolk.com. Everything's there, including ways to connect, read more, and keep this movement going. The links are going to be in the show notes too, if that's easier, including to everything that Jon's been working on. This project, this podcast, is about rallying good men who don't want to be perfect, but who do want to be better. Men who want to live with more honesty, more agency, and more heart. Thanks for tuning in. Work hard, be kind, and I'll catch you on the next one.